Good morning, everyone. I'm Kim Schmidt, Managing Editor of Farm Equipment Magazine, here with No-Till Farmer Managing Editor Laura Barrera, and we'd like to welcome you to this morning's joint Farm Equipment and No-Till Farmer webinar. Today we're going to be hearing from Phil Needham, owner of Needham Ag Technologies, and also one of this year's 25 No-Till Legends, which was named at this year's National No-Tillage Conference in St. Louis. He'll be talking about how to choose the right no-till attachments for your or your customer's soils and conditions. Today's webinar is sponsored by Martin Industries, the manufacturers of Martin Till planter attachments and tools. We want to thank Martin Industries for making today's webinar possible. We also want to thank our presenter Phil Needham for sharing in today's webinar some of the different no-till attachments available and the soils and conditions they perform best in. Before we turn things over to Phil, there's a couple of housekeeping items we want to make you aware of. On your screen, there's an orange box with a white arrow inside of it. You can click on that and it will open up to reveal a question or comment field that will allow you to submit questions at any time during the presentation. At the end of the webinar, we'll look to answer as many questions as possible. If for any reason the webinar is disrupted or you seem to be disconnected from the webinar, just go back to the invitation email you received and rejoin the webinar through the link in the email, just as you did today when you logged in. With that said, thanks again for joining us, and I will turn over the controls to Phil Needham. Good morning, Phil.
Good morning, Kim. Thank you for that introduction. Well, good morning, everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. It's 25 degrees in Kentucky, but at least it's not snowing in the Northeast like I've seen on the weather this morning. It's a big country, and I'm guessing there's some visitors from other countries here also, but it is a big country here in the U.S. with a lot of growing conditions. And I did talk to a grower yesterday from Arizona that was actually planting barley. So planting season for many of you is getting to be pretty close, I'm sure. So what I'm going to spend is approximately 45 minutes here with you this morning by means of a PowerPoint presentation to discuss a lot of the attachments and things that we need to be thinking about to help you generate higher yields and higher profits, because that's obviously what we're trying to do. And just by means of a 30 or 50,000 feet elevation perspective, what we're looking at here on the screen is a nice cornfield with uniform emergence and uniform plant health. And that becomes more of a challenge as we start no-tilling, okay? And most of this presentation will be discussing no-till or strip-till, but there'll obviously be some content for conventional tillage also. So there should be good content for a wide range of producers across a wide range of different areas. So I'd like to start out with this slide, and I often hear the comment, yields begin at planting time. And I think that's very true from some perspectives, but from my perspective, I think high yields begin when you're harvesting the previous crop. So it absolutely begins with uniform residue management at the back of the combine. And for some manufacturers, that's more of a challenge than others, in which there's a lot of combines out there that aren't capable of spreading residue across the harvesting width of the header. So for example, here we've got a combine with a spreader on the back, and I think a spreader is a better option if you're doing some tillage. If you're in no-till, especially higher residue no-till, then I believe a chopper would be a better option. But either way, whether it's a spreader or whether it's a chopper, it's important that that combine does a good job spreading residue as evenly as possible across the harvesting width, because just the differences in crop residue, like I'm showing here in this image, can have a huge impact on the speed of emergence of a following crop. Even if you're conventional tillage in the middle of Illinois, where this photograph was taken, if you're not doing a good job spreading residue, it shows up in the image you can see here, which will have an impact on the soil temperature, which indirectly has an impact on the uniformity of the emergence of the following crop. We often see that. So I work as an agronomist, and we often see significant differences in emergence. And all of these corn plants or seeds in the bottom right-hand corner, by means of an example, came from the same row within a no-till field. So we are obviously looking for high standards of emergence uniformity, by which this is an example of what isn't very uniform. Peter Johnson in Ontario allowed me to use this slide. This was some research he did in no-till conditions in 2016. And what he found was on day one, if all of the plants emerged within 1 day, which is basically what that means, he saw he had 100% yield potential. But as some of these plants had delayed emergence, for example, 2 days difference in emergence, there was a 5% yield loss. All the way to day 6, so if a plant emerged 6 days later than the first one, he showed a 42% yield loss. So some of these yield reductions are huge, and there's a lot of specific elements that have an impact on corn emergence, and that's pretty much what we're going to be spending time on this morning, trying to figure out how to get a better stand, better percentage emergence, but more uniform emergence also. Historically, a lot of no-till cultures used, and there's some areas across the country that still use a no-till culture. I'm going to suggest for anyone that's still using a no-till culture, make some good observations. And if you ever see, especially within moist soil conditions like I'm showing here on a silty loam soil, if you ever see the no-till culture throw out soil like I'm showing here, that would be a good example of when the no-till culture needs to be removed. Because a wavy, aggressive wavy culture like this, if it throws soil out, like we're showing here, it gets underneath the gauge wheel, as you can see in this image, and actually changes the seeding depth. Not only does it change the seeding depth, it often throws soil out of the seed zone or the seed row, making it more of a challenge to close the seed slot consistently. So there, in my opinion, there's very few environments where a no-till culture helps, but there's a lot of conditions where a no-till culture actually hurts, and growers need to be aware of where those conditions are. About the only set of conditions I have seen a no-till culture to be positive is if you're seeding or planting into heavy, thatched, tight residue, maybe in a field that was in CRP, maybe a field of no-till corn into pasture. Either of those would be examples where I think a no-till culture would help. But if you're seeding in conditions like this, I would encourage the no-till cultures to be removed. And this is another example of where a no-till culture has some detrimental effects. So on the bottom left-hand corner, as you can see, was a piece of soil that was thrown out with a no-till culture. So the gauge wheels climbed up on that chunk of soil, and as a result of that, you can see there is a seed to the left and another seed about 6 or 7 inches down the row that was shallow. So no-till cultures can have a detrimental effect on seeding depth. So if you see conditions like this or occurrences like this, again, I would encourage the no-till cultures to be removed. You're planting crops such as soybeans into corn stalks in a no-till environment, similar to what we're seeing here. And a lot of producers have been successfully no-tilling soybeans into corn stalks. There's few environments where tillage help. If you can add row cleaners to a planter, it's going to eliminate some of the issues that you see in the row to the left-hand side, in which a large cross-section or a cross-hatching of corn stalks actually raised up the gauge wheels, and then the seeds were planted shallow and didn't emerge, especially in drier conditions. So it's going to be important as we move forward to part the residue to help get better gauge wheel following of the ground, more uniform down pressure, and more uniform seeding depth, in addition to soil warming that we'll discuss in a little bit more detail in a moment. Plan of row cleaners in most environments, row cleaners are going to be positive. The only environments where row cleaners are going to struggle is in tall cover crop. We'll discuss these issues here in a moment. But if you're seeding in higher residue, no-till conditions, and this is a good example where a grower was no-tilling corn back into heavy wheat residue that wasn't very well distributed, it's going to be impossible in some of these environments to get uniform seeding depth if you can't cut through that residue. So in many environments, you're much better off using a row cleaner, the residue, rather than a huge amount of downforce with the coulters or the double disc openers to try and cut through it. So historically, a fixed row cleaner was available on the market, and there's certainly still a place for fixed row cleaners. The place where a fixed row cleaner still performs better than a floating one would be in heavy residue conditions further north in the US, where there's not been a lot of residue decomposition over the winter months, and a floating one sometimes can climb up over that dense residue. But if you've got more residue that's broken down, we'd certainly recommend the floating one. The floating one offers the benefits of better terrain following ability, especially on more rolling soils, because this is an example of a fixed row cleaner. On the right-hand side, it was digging. On the left-hand side, it was barely parting the residue. So we find it to be very difficult to set and adjust a fixed row cleaner so it parts residue consistently. And we often see examples like this, in which the left-hand row has corn that's approximately a leaf stage ahead of the next row over to the right, just because of the difference in soil warming. And we often see heavier residue has significantly cooler soil temperatures underneath the residue. We really prefer the floating row cleaners, have the ability to raise and descend to adjust for slight topographical variations in the soil surface, okay? So you don't have to adjust them. In most conditions, you'll drop them all the way down until the aluminum depth band, which is what I'm showing here, contacts the soil surface, and that basically sets your depth. So the teeth around the outside of the depth band won't ever engage the soil deeper than what the depth band is riding on the soil surface. So they basically adjust or set your depth. Now, there may be some soil conditions which are looser. You don't need them set quite that deep or that quite as aggressively. Within those environments, you can obviously raise them up. But a lot of conditions that I work with in no-till areas, we're allowing the row cleaners to go all the way down and float to part residue beyond the gauge wheels, similar to what I'm showing here. So these are 4.5-inch wide gauge wheels. You've got about 1.5 inches between them for the double disc. You've got about 10 or 11 inches that you need to clear a band within with the row cleaner to get good, consistent ride quality of the gauge wheels and the row unit. Even in heavier environments, this is in Kentucky, no-tilling corn back up into heavy corn stalks. Within most of these conditions, as long as you've got decent residue deterioration over the winter, a floating row cleaner like this works very well. And this one's shown with the Martin UMO 100 fertilizer opener that can put fertilizer 1, 2, or 3 inches off to the side, even with 3/4 below or 3/4 above seed depth. So it gives you 9 options from a point of view of placement. When we start looking at no-till into cool, wet conditions, we see increasing benefits to getting nitrogen and often sulfur and sometimes other nutrients, but principally nitrogen and phosphorus in a band under that row. So as that seed germinates and the roots grow outwards at 30 to 40 degrees, they're hitting that band of fertilizer. And later on, if I get time, I'm going to compare and contrast surface applied applications or dribble applied applications of fertilizer on top of the row, because we've seen, especially in dry seasons, the roots are growing away from the fertilizer that's on top of the ground rather than towards it. So I think in high yield systems, high yield no-till systems, and cooler soils especially, it's very positive to have a band of fertilizer under the row and to the side so the roots can grow towards it. Often in Kentucky and the southeast US, it's pretty common to be planting soybeans in a double crop environment into heavy wheat straw. And the Kentucky state average is around 80 bushels per acre now, and we often have fields over 100 bushels per acre. So when you're planting soybeans into 100 bushel or greater yielding wheat, you've got a lot of residue. So number one, as we started out, you've got to spread the residue as evenly as possible. But if you're trying to plant soybeans or any crop into heavy residue like this, we often see that depth bands combined with wheel weights inside the depth bands, and here's a graph of that, the black still weight inside the depth bands gives you additional downforce on the row cleaner to keep the row cleaner engaged in the heavy residue. And then depth of the row cleaner is controlled by the depth band, as we see here. So these are good options, especially if you're planting into heavy wheat straw. benefit of a row cleaner is going to be improving ride quality. So I mentioned a moment ago about parting residue, which improves ride quality. So you're clearing corn stalks or milo residue, which is what this is, out of the way of the gauge wheel to help improve ride quality. But if you've got any kind of wheel tracks, in one of the early images I showed a combine unloaded into a grain cart, leaving wheel tracks in the field, obviously. Oftentimes it's beneficial just to have some gentle tillage action out of the row cleaner when it's set in the lowest position to smooth out some of these wheel tracks. So that would be another benefit of a row cleaner. Probably one of the biggest benefits of a row cleaner in a no-till system, when you're lightly scratching the soil surface, you're going to see increased soil warming. So approximately 1 hour after making a pass with the planter on the left side of the screen, we check soil temperature at seed depth, and then we check at the same depth the soil temperature under the heavy residue. And we're often seeing 7, 8 Fahrenheit difference in temperatures as a result of lightly scratching the soil, as we see here on the left-hand side. More recently, we've acquired a FLIR thermal camera, which is what this image was taken with, and we're just now learning basically what we can learn with a thermal camera. And if you look vertically up the slide here, where you see the yellow strips and the white strips, that pass was made with a 4-row Kinze 3000 series planter. It's the planter we use for test plots. And that pass where you see the yellow parallel 30-inch rows, those passes were made with the row cleaner down into the lowest floating position, and then running across those rows from the left to right, where the planter stopped, you can see there's some purple rows. Well, in the time period of approximately 1 hour, 4 rows to the right had warmed about 6 or 7 degrees just using the thermal camera. So in the course of just 1 hour, the soil had warmed 6 or 7 degrees compared to the pass that was just made shortly before I took this photograph at an angle. So we're in the process of making a video. We shot a video to accompany this. It should be up on YouTube soon. So if you look for Needham Ag thermal camera or a description very similar to that, we'll put it up on YouTube pretty soon. But yeah, there's a lot we've learned with a thermal camera that shows us the importance of uniform clearing of residue and uniform scratching of the soil surface in a no-till environment to try and promote uniform emergence. Okay, and the other big thing about a thermal camera, you can see differences in soil temperature as a result of residue cover. So if you can't spread residue evenly across the harvester width at harvest time, you've got some pretty big differences in soil temperature. So unless you can start with a relatively uniform soil temperature, you're not going to get the standards of emergence that you need for high yields. Let's spend just a minute talking about fertilizer placement. I often see examples where growers are using, for example, a 2x2 type fertilizer placement system. It could be all nitrogen. More preferably, it's going to be a nitrogen with some phosphate in it also, in a band deeper than and to the side of the seed. So as we mentioned earlier on, as the roots grow out and downwards, they migrate into that band of fertilizer, which is pretty important. The middle row here in the screen, as you can see it, has significantly lower growth, poorer plant health, and this was simply in a row where the 2x2 fertilizer plugged up in that row. So there's going to be some big differences, especially in no-till systems where you can place fertilizer in a band to the side, especially in heavy residue no-till systems, especially when you're planting into cool no-till conditions. For different options, the frame mount, John Deere frame mount fertilizer opener, as you can see to the left-hand side of the screen, these work pretty well in heavy residue conditions, pretty good opener. It's a higher expense opener, but it still does a reasonable job. The only limitation of this type opener is if you're running in heavy residue, sometimes that opener does not cut through that residue very well. So it would be better to have a row cleaner ahead of that fertilizer opener, which would part the residue to allow the fertilizer opener to cut through the ground at a consistent depth to place fertilizer. The Martin UMO 100 that we mentioned just a little while ago has the ability to be included within the row cleaner. So we've got a floating row cleaner here on the front. Within the floating row cleaner, we've got the UMO 100 fertilizer opener. So this is a better system because the row cleaner is obviously parting the residue for the double disc openers and the fertilizer opener. The only reason I'm showing this image, if you get into harder soils, harder no-till conditions, even some of the newest planters that look heavy aren't heavy enough, especially out on the wings. So even with some of the new planters with airbags, we find out that the wings are not heavy enough, and you can see that the frame on the outer wings is starting to raise up here. And you can see that the parallel linkages within this planter row unit are not level or not horizontal or as horizontal as they need to be. So in a lot of situations, when you start adding row unit mounted fertilizer openers, similar to what we see in here, in some conditions you're going to have to add weight to the wings or weight to the center section or both to enable that fertilizer opener to descend down into the soil and not affect the penetration of the double disc openers. There are 4-row 3000 series Kinze planter that we used, and when we bought this, we bought the Precision Planting 2020 system. We're a big fan of that. It just shows us a lot of information that we can learn from and make good decisions from to make better adjustments from. And one of the most fundamental things that we saw from the 2020 was, if you look on the left side of the planter as we view it, there's obviously the ground contact wheel or the ground drive wheel. So as the planter lowers down, it presses against the ground drive wheel, obviously to get drive for the row units. And when we lowered it down, it took approximately 100 pounds of weight off the left side as we view this planter. So to compensate for that, we had to add a 100-pound John Deere weight and bolt it to the front. And unless we had the 2020 monitor, we would never have realized that that ground drive was detracting weight from that side of the frame. So not only was it detracting weight from the left side, it was actually transferring some of the weight to the other side. So we did not have a good, consistent downforce on the row units until we added a 100-pound weight to that side of the planter. Really like the 2020 system. It just gives you a lot of information that really helps you set up a planter to do a better job. And again, in many situations, we've learned weight on the wings of these planters to operate a fertilizer opener on a row unit similar to this. Again, this is a floating row cleaner. This is an older 125 Martin floating row cleaner. This time it's got clean sweep on it, an airbag system or an air system that actually works really well to hold the row cleaners down in heavy corn-on-corn residue, similar to what you see in here. So again, the Precision Planting system or the Precision Planting 2020 monitor allowed us to learn where the weight needed to be placed on the planter and how much. A lot more people are planting into cover crops now, and we'd certainly encourage that. The more residue and the more cover you can keep on the ground, especially in higher rainfall areas, the more we can control or reduce soil erosion. So I'm a big fan of cover crops. This is rye. Rye in this example, not cereal rye, but planted into it pretty small. Obviously, some growers are letting cereal rye, which is obviously a different kind of cover crop, but they're letting it get really tall, similar to this. And this is obviously a mix of cereal rye and vetch. This is my son, and he's 6 foot tall now, so some of that vetch is as tall as him. And I really encourage growers to plant into cover crops. However, I've seen challenges planting into tall cover crops like this, and one of the challenges is just being able to plant through it, get consistent emergence and the kind of yield potential that you'd have with planting into it when it's smaller. So I'm quite concerned about planting into cereal rye, especially if you're planting corn into cereal rye. I know Ken Ferry, the Farm Journal agronomist, he's seen significant yield losses planting corn into cereal rye. So the only situations I would encourage planting into cereal rye is if you don't get it very thick, and I would encourage you to terminate it when it's a little bit smaller. Certainly not let it get this high, but again, if you've got experience otherwise, then I'd go with the experience in your area. Planting soybeans into cereal rye is a much easier process, especially with a grain drill like this one. This is just a John Deere 750 that we use, and you'll see the weight on the back. That weight weighs 2,200 pounds plus the steel frame that it sits on. And without this weight, we could not cut through this cereal rye at all. We were just having problems cutting through it, and we had to add a block of weight on the back to try and hold it down into the ground consistently. So I'd be encouraging you to look at weight. I'm not saying you need weight everywhere, but I'm going to say there are a lot of environments where weight has to be added to a drill or a planter to get the kind of consistency of soil engagement of the row units that you need. This drill is also equipped with the Martin 20-point wheels that do a much better job closing the seed slot, especially in higher residue no-till conditions, and certainly don't bounce as much as the standard cast wheels. This drill is also equipped with the narrow gauge wheels. A lot of producers are putting narrow gauge wheels on drills and planters just because they do a better job following the contours of the ground and leaving more residue standing, which is very important if you're planting into corn stalks, because the standard 4-inch or 4.5-inch wide gauge wheels are often too wide and they climb up on more corn residue, influencing seeding depth. So a lot of things going on here, but I'd certainly encourage you to consider more weight, especially if you're planting into higher residue environments or harder soils, or the combination of the two. I want to spend just a moment here about seed firming. This photograph was taken 3 days after the crop was planted, and we had a big rain after it was planted. But we often see seeds that are not pressed all the way to the bottom of the seed slot, and there's various reasons why they're not. So we're really a fan of Keaton seed firmers, because the Keaton seed firmers, especially in no-till conditions, do a good job pressing those seeds down to the bottom of the seed slot to try and achieve more consistent seeding depth. And you can also see in this image the sidewall is quite smeared behind the seed and to the left of the seed. So when you get into higher clay content soils, especially when you're planting into cool, wet, no-till conditions, we do see a lot of sidewall compaction. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But we really encourage the use of the Keaton seed firmers. We found that maybe 1 or 2 years into adding them to the planter, they have adequate downforce. After year 2, they often lose a lot of their downforce, and to wear them out, we encourage you to add the Mojo wire, which is just a simple spring arrangement that will press the Keaton seed firmers down. And in a lot of environments, it gives them another year or two's worth of use. But generally speaking, in most environments, a Keaton seed firmer has enough downforce for maybe 1 or 2 years. And the 3rd year, we would suggest adding the Mojo wire just to give it more downforce again. If you've got a drill similar to a John Deere single disc opener, there are some different firming wheels on the market. This is one I designed. It's called the V8 firming wheel. We actually made this wheel, or designed this wheel, by making concrete molds of the seed slot. So we basically made some concrete forms and used some quick setting concrete. And we made some forms of the seed slot. So we found that the seed slot is tapered on one side, almost straight on the other. In most environments, it's between approximately 5/8 and 3/4 of an inch in width. And having a wheel that matches that profile is pretty important. This V8 firming wheel has the same bearing within it that's within the gauge wheels. It's what we call the 5203 bearing. So that's a very good long life bearing. So we're adding longer life and a better job of firming seeds into the bottom of the seed slot. So basically collecting the seeds and pressing them down to the bottom of the seed slot is really important, especially in low moisture areas, because sometimes getting the seed locked into the bottom of the seed slot, whether it's corn or beans or wheat, is pretty important to try and get more uniform emergence. Spend just a few minutes talking about different closing systems on planters and drills. Planting in higher moisture, no-till conditions similar to this, I think you're always going to be challenged with a pair of smooth, standard factory wheels. The depth here on the closing wheel arm tail is in the first notch, but in these conditions you could crank the down pressure up to maximum and still not close the seed slot. You just physically can't close the seed slot in these conditions, oftentimes with standard factory wheels within these conditions. And there are many similar variants of wheels on the market. Some are rubber, some are plastic, some are forged, some are cast, but the same principle exists with a lot of these closing systems in heavy residue, no-till conditions like I'm showing here. It's really a challenge to get the seed slot closed within these conditions. So if you're having challenges planting into these conditions and getting the seed slot closed, different options such as spading wheels. One of the biggest benefits of a spading closing wheel is it will help spade in the smeared sidewalls to help eliminate sidewall compaction. If you're no-tilling into heavy residue, cool, especially clay soils, we see a lot of sidewall compaction, and this is a good example running right to left. And we also see it in wheat. So this was a wheat plant at harvest time where we could still see the sidewall compaction as a result of planting this crop in wet conditions. The Martin spading wheels have been around for 20 or 30 years now, and they give closing action which is a lot different than wheels that press down from the top. With minimal to no down pressure, they're able to engage the soil as shown here in this image from both sides, pressing the seed slot closed from the bottom. So they're not relying on compression from the soil surface, they're squeezing the seed slot closed from the side. And the principle of leaving loose soil above the seed is very important, and we've seen faster emergence in conditions that look a lot like this, where we're comparing a pair of spike wheels. These are 13-inch spike wheels. When we're comparing a pair of these wheels to a pair of standard wheels or cast wheels or forged wheels that are just physically pressing down from the top. Because obviously we need a loose soil environment with oxygen for that seed to emerge fast. And this helps with the emergence, and it helps with eliminating some of the sidewall compaction. Here we're closing the slot in very moist soils with zero down pressure on the closing wheel arm. So we're able to do a reasonable job closing the slot. The Martin drag chain runs behind to drop a little bit of loose soil into any areas not completely closed to stop the corn plants leafing out underground. But a pair of standard wheels or any of the plastic or forged wheels would struggle to close the seed slot within these conditions. The only point I'd like to make is it's important that the closing wheel arm, as viewed here, needs to be parallel or consistently parallel with the top of the soil surface as much as possible. Because as that closing wheel arm descends down at the back during planting, the gathering action as a result of the compound angle between the wheels actually decreases as that closing wheel arm descends downwards. So it's pretty important that the top of that closing wheel arm is parallel with the top of the ground. And if that's not the case, there are some drop-down brackets available from Martin Industries that will drop the wheels down 1 inch to level that closing wheel arm back up again. So it's pretty important to have that closing wheel arm level with the spike wheels. Previous images showing a pair of 13-inch wheels. In some conditions, it's actually preferable to have a single 15-inch wheel running alongside a smooth wheel, similar to what we see in here. So a similar set of no-till conditions to the left, where the standard wheels were not able to close the seat slot, compared to the same planter, the same pass, running a 15-inch wheel on the left and a smooth wheel on the right, which provides depth control, which is spading in the slot and eliminating sidewall compaction on one side. This gives you depth control, and the right-hand side image, the 15-inch wheel, is a more general purpose closing system that'll take you from medium moisture through to drier soils, compared to the pair of 13-inch wheels that do much better in higher moisture soils, but when the soils start getting drier, you may be better off switching to a single 15 or back to the standard wheels. And it's obviously very important to adjust the spacing between the smooth wheel and the spike wheel correctly. It's pretty difficult. You go back to this one. Pretty difficult, if not impossible, for the spading wheels to get into seeds if they're correctly spaced. The correct distance from point to point on a pair of 13-inch spike wheels is 2.5 inches. So you're 1.25 inches away from the seed. So there should be no conditions where the spike wheels, as shown in this example, should get into seed. Maybe the only set of conditions if you was turning pretty tight, which we wouldn't recommend. If you was turning pretty tight, the spading wheels might swing over a little bit, but correctly adjusted spike wheels should not get into seed, especially if they are pressed downwards with a Keeton seed firmer. So if you put in spading wheels on a planter, we definitely recommend the Keeton seed firmer, which also gives you the ability to place a pop-up fertilizer in the row also, and perhaps a fungicide or insecticide, which is often beneficial also. Some yield data came from Practical Farm Research, and these guys need to be commended because they're doing a lot of practical research, just as their name suggests. So they're looking at different closing systems. And when you're looking at any research, it's often really important to look at the conditions that the crop was planted within, because a lot of the things I've showed you here today are no-till. And when you look at a lot of research, it's not no-till research. So if you're a no-till or a strict till, you need to be looking at research that's specific to no-till or strict till. For example, this data set has a fall chisel and spring vertical tillage. So this is a good set of data that would be specific to that set of conditions. And this set of data, and it's 3 years worth of data, I would certainly encourage you to look at 3 years or more worth of data. Ideally replicated data. I'm not sure this site was replicated, but it is 3 years worth of data, which gives you more confidence. But within this set of data, that was Kentucky data from 2013, 14, and 15, the Martin single spike wheel and solid wheel had the highest yield on average. And you can look at different closing wheel options within this data set. But again, I'd encourage you to look at research preferably from your area, and look at research that represents your tillage practice. Lastly, for those of you that are running planters, the case planters have got some advantages. They come standard with RID tires. They come standard with slightly smaller diameter row opener discs. They have a slightly smaller included angle between the row opener discs, so you've got a smaller, more acute seed slot in size. And if you are planting into higher moisture, no-till conditions, similar to what we're showing here, Martin makes what they call the SCW899, which is a pair of spike closing wheels. They basically replace the two 9-inch standard factory discs, and they do a much better job closing the seed slot, especially in high moisture no-till conditions. So they actually do a good job, combined with the rubber packer wheel at the back that firms it back down gently. That's a pretty good closing system for a case planter. Okay. I'm going to turn it to you. I'm guessing you have questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Phil, for going through that presentation. We do have a couple of questions submitted today and from previously, so I'll just go through them. First question we've got, and I know you kind of addressed this at the beginning of the webinar, but what recommendations do you have for planting into high wheat residue?
Sure. So as I mentioned in the presentation, it's pretty common here to plant soybeans double cropped into wheat residue. And if you get 80 or 100 bushel wheat or higher yields than that, the proportion of residue increases obviously with yield. So absolutely step one is to make sure the residue is spread as uniformly as possible at harvest time. So that's going to be step one. Leaving the residue as tall as possible, preferably using a stripper header, that would be step two, because the more you can leave residue tall and standing, the less you're going to give the combine an opportunity to mess up the residue distribution. So that would be step one and two. Once you've got the residue spread evenly and preferably leaving the stubble as tall as possible, I'm going to suggest the next step would be to find a floating row cleaner. And if you're planting into heavy residue, you probably need one or two sets of wheel weights per row. Each wheel weight weighs approximately 4 pounds, so a pair would be 8, 2 pairs would be 16. An air system, such as the Precision Planting Clean Sweep system, would also give you some benefits to hold in or press in those row cleaners down to keep them consistently engaged in the residue. So those would be my suggestions, Kim, from a point of view of setting up a planter for no-tilling soybeans into wheat.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phil. This question was submitted this morning. This person is wondering if row cleaners are necessary for no-tilling into silage corn stubble. Do you feel that there's probably enough residue there that row cleaners are necessary, or what advice would you give to this person?
I'm going to guess if it's corn silage and most of the residue being removed, the benefits of the row cleaner would be reduced. However, if you was planting at an angle to the silage rows and that corn stubble was sticking up 4 inches, 6 inches, whatever it is, having a row cleaner in front of the double disc openers to blow those crowns out of the way would probably be positive. Now, maybe if you're planting corn back on corn, you can split the rows and that wouldn't be an issue. But if you was planting at an angle and your row units were climbing over those corn crowns, I think a row cleaner would be beneficial to give you more uniform ride quality on the gauge wheels, so they wasn't climbing over the corn crown.
Okay, great. This question that we've got is more of a request, Phil. This person is wondering if you could click back to that slide you had of the spacing between the closing wheels again. Could you go back to that slide?
So this shows them from the smooth wheel to the 15-inch spike wheel. In this example, the distance measured horizontally from the smooth wheel across horizontally to the spike wheel, we recommend 2 to 2¼ inches in that measurement position. So put the tape measure in the arch of the spike wheel, press the tape measure across at the closest point, which is what this image shows, across to the smooth wheel. 2 to 2¼ inches is the suggested measurement for this this kind of spading wheel. And if you're running the 13-inch wheels, what I showed you a minute ago was a smooth and a 15-inch wheel. Running a pair of 13-inch wheels, they need to be adjusted at the closest point, tooth to tooth at the bottom. They need to be adjusted to 2.5 inches. So a slightly greater distance with the pair of 13-inch wheels compared to the single 15. But you're only spading one side with the 15 compared to spading two sides with the pair of 13. So if you're no-tilling into higher moisture soils, especially higher moisture clay soils, you'd be benefiting much more by having a pair of 13-inch wheels which are spading both sides.
All right, thanks, Phil. Got a couple questions here about using fertilizer during planting. Someone is wondering how effective it is to use a fertilizer band on top of the soil on either side of the row. And another question we have is, does it pay to put nitrogen close to the row with the planter? Could you address those concerns?
Sure. So we're strong advocates of placing fertilizer in a band under the row. We're strong advocates in no-till conditions to add nitrogen and phosphate and other nutrients deemed suitable by the soil test. But in most situations, it's nitrogen and some phosphate, because phosphate obviously doesn't move much, if anything, in the soil. Phosphate needs to be placed in a band under and to the side of the emerging seed, so it grows out and downwards. Okay, nitrogen will move with adequate moisture, but what we find is we want the roots to grow out and downwards and pick up the nitrogen and the phosphate. And if you're in Kansas or in any other environment where it doesn't rain, if you've got fertilizer sitting on top, your roots are basically growing away from that band of fertilizer, and they probably wouldn't pick up the phosphate early in the season when it's needed either. So I would strongly encourage guys to get it in a band to the side and under the row. The other challenge is if you're dribbling it on top, separation, especially if you're just dribbling it on the back with a totally tubular type tube. If it's windy, some of that fertilizer can get down into the seed slot and cause seedling injury. We've even seen plots where we've done row placed or fertilizer off to the side with a 2x2 type system, comparing it to nitrogen on top. You get a much faster and more consistent greening within the crop if you're placing it in the ground to dribbling it on top. So I know that there's a lot of guys out there want to hit the easy button. It's cheaper, it's easier to dribble it on top, but I don't think they're going to get the benefits of placing it in the soil to the side. And if you look at what a lot of these high yield contest winners, the Randy Dowdys, the David Hewlett's of the world, they're now advocating putting fertilizer to both sides. So that's reducing the rate, but they're putting it on both sides of the row. So you're going to see more products in that category, I'm sure. Martin Industries has a new one that they're testing. It's going to be a limited release this year in 2017, but they will have a fertilizer opener this year for testing that will place fertilizer in a band to both sides. The only concern with that is it will take a newer style planter that has adequate downforce, or the ability to transfer weight from the frame to the row units to be able to maintain consistent downforce on the row. So yeah, just a few observations and thoughts when it comes to fertilizer on top versus in the ground. The only thing I will add, if you get any kind of stress conditions at all, high moisture stress, dry weather stress, the fertilizer positioned off to the side really shines in them conditions, Kim.
All right, thanks, Phil. Another question we have is about down pressure. Can you review the change in down pressure when using the top drive system?
Planter, it's a 3000 series Kinsey. It's a 4-row with a fertilizer tank, as you can see. And what we saw, well, we didn't see it until we got the 2020. So when we got the 2020 system that obviously measures downforce on every row unit, we've got the strain gauge pins on every one of the 4 row units. When we lowered the planter down and that planter drive wheel contacted the main planter ground wheel, if you want to call it, it was taking approximately 100 pounds off the side of the planter. So we had to add a 100-pound weight back to that side of the planter to compensate for that. Again, without the 2020 system, we would never have realized or imagined that that was an issue. But we found we had 50 pounds more weight on the 2 row units on the far side than we did the side illustrated in the photograph with the weight before we added the weight. So without the 2020, we did not realize that. So we've learned a lot from a 2020. You get to learn a lot of things. One of the things we've learned is how much downforce it takes to push a no-till coulter into the ground. You know, we've had great luck, especially with row cleaners out front, removing no-till coulters and just using a row cleaner to part the residue so you don't have to cut through it. But when you start putting wavy coulters in there, especially aggressively wavy coulters, like I showed in the presentation, it takes anywhere between 100 and 150 pounds more downforce to press them in the ground, plus you get the disadvantage, like I showed in higher moisture soils, especially higher moisture clay and silty soils, where it ends up throwing soil out that gets under the gauge wheel. So again, there's not many conditions where no-till coulters help. There's a lot of conditions where a no-till coulter hurts.
All right, thanks, Phil. This question is about strip till. This person is wondering whether you have different recommendations for using row cleaners and closing wheels in strip till versus no-till.
Sure, so a lot of the same principles would be the same. Strip till is going to be more like a conventional tillage environment in which the soil is obviously going to be softer. So a floating row cleaner would probably be the best option with depth bands, perhaps even the wide depth bands. They don't fit on every planter because of conflicts with wheel modules, but sometimes in loose soil conditions, the wider depth bands offered by Precision Planting are a benefit. The clean sweep system or an air adjust system might be a benefit also in strip till, and those are most beneficial to growers that have, you know, 50% no-till, 50% strip till, so you can make adjustments quickly and easily from a tractor cab, which is often important. You know, historically, with the pin adjust row cleaners, a grower would set them the same and would rarely adjust them as they needed to be adjusted. So being able to adjust something quickly and easily from the cab is important, and if it's quickly and easily adjusted, then people are more likely to adjust them. Regarding closing wheels, the 15-inch wheel alongside the smooth wheel would be a much better choice, I think, in most strip till conditions than a pair of 13s. The pair of 13s are much better suited for no-till, higher moisture soils. So maybe your strip till's higher moisture too, and you'd benefit from a pair of 13s. I think the single 15-inch wheel alongside the smooth would be a better general purpose wheel for conventional soils and for strip till environments.
All right, thanks, Phil. This person is wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference between the types of row cleaners out there, specifically the air and hydraulic or floating row cleaners versus the ones that are more of a push system, as well as Dawn's pull type setup. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between those and, you know, whether ones are more suitable for certain conditions versus others?
Sure, so the Dawn system is frame mount and obviously cab adjustable, which offers some benefits, and that's a good system. It's a very expensive system. We've found that the Martin system, similar to this, does a good job parting residue in most conditions, and you can add obviously the clean sweep to it to give you infinite adjustment or close to infinite adjustment from the tractor cab also. So you need to look at these different systems, talk to growers in your areas that are running both of them within similar soils and conditions. But in my experience, the Martin one works pretty well in most conditions. If you're running in heavy corn-on-corn environments, you can add wheel weights, like I've mentioned. You can add clean sweep. So the Martin system is a pretty good one that works in most residue conditions, in my opinion. The other choice is the fixed row cleaners, like I discussed earlier on. The fixed row cleaners are becoming fewer and fewer between. I think Martin's told me less than 5% of their sales now are a fixed row cleaner design, so 95% of the industry is floating now. And there's just a lot of benefits to the floating row cleaner, in which if you're on ground that's just gently rolling, or terraces, the floating row cleaner is able to float over the soil conditions to part residue and lightly scratch the soil surface much more consistently than a fixed one like this that tends to dig. And if a pair of 15-inch fixed row cleaner wheels like this ever dig, then the gauge wheels descend down into the trench that the row cleaners created, causing the row cleaner to dig further. So if you're not careful, the fixed row cleaners tend to hunt up and down. If they ever make a trench, then the gauge wheels sit down into that trench and dig worse. So we often see a lot of situations that look like this, and this was an example where fixed row cleaners were being used. One row was being cleared too much, and the one next door to it wasn't hardly being cleared at all. So the floating row cleaners are going to do a much better job parting residue in these heavier residue environments, especially if you've got some differences in topographies within the fields.
All right, great, Phil. We've got time for one more question. This one is going back to downforce, and this person says he understands the need of downforce, but is wondering whether it's worth it to invest more with the new hydraulic downforce systems compared to air-controlled down pressure. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you would recommend?
Looking for my photo. Give me just a second. I think it's further back. I was going to bring up the 2020 image. Right here. I'm going to say the answer to that question would probably lie within watching that bottom left-hand corner of a 2020 display. To an extent, you could watch it without a 2020 just by riding behind or riding on a four-wheeler alongside. But the 2020 will give you much more substantial evidence into the benefits of a hydraulic or an air downforce adjust system that adjusts automatically based upon the load cell values within the row units. And what we often see, another important piece, it's not just the margin, it's the percentage ground contact. We often see areas in the fields where the gauge wheels lose 100% ground contact. So we're normally pushing the margin up within those areas to try and make sure the gauge wheels are in 100% contact with the ground all of the time. But if you've got fields with different soils, different topographies, you see huge differences in the margin number, the 118 I'm showing here on the screen. You see it go from almost zero, maybe up to 200 pounds in very light, loose areas of the fields. So having an adjustable system like DeltaForce is really positive from a point of view of maintaining a more consistent margin on a row-by-row basis as that planter moves backwards and forwards across the field. I'm going to say the environments that benefit most would obviously be rolling fields, would obviously be fields with a lot of soil types, which is most fields, but a combination of different soil types and different topographies, maybe even fields that half of the field's been tilled and half of the field hasn't been tilled for different reasons. All of these would be examples that would stack the benefits of a DeltaForce type system definitely in the grower's favor. Right now, with commodity prices, it's going to be more difficult to justify short term. You're looking at a longer payoff, but there's going to be a lot of benefits to these systems within the environments I've mentioned.
Okay, we've had a number of questions that we did not get to, so if your question wasn't answered, we will be sharing those with Phil, and he will answer those and get back with us. Before we conclude, I just wanted to give everyone a heads up that when you log off today, you'll receive a questionnaire to complete. It's simple, easy to complete with just a few questions, and your answers will help us determine the value of today's webinar and plan for future webinars. Second, we'll be making available via email to you a replay of today's webinar in the event you'd like to go back and review the entire presentation or parts of the presentation. You'll also find the replay up on our No-Till Farmer and Farm Equipment websites shortly under the Resources tab. There you will also find our archived webinars, so you can go back and listen to other recently completed webinars if you'd like. Thanks again to Phil for leading today's presentation and to Martin Industries for sponsoring this webinar. Also thanks to Joe Kinsley, who was our producer for today's webinar. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope your preparations for the 2017 growing season are going smoothly.